Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. Baha'u'llah. Training in morals and good conduct is far more important than book learning. A child that is cleanly, agreeable, of good character, well behaved, even though he be ignorant, is preferable to a child that is rude, unwashed, ill-natured, and yet becoming deeply versed in all the sciences and arts. The reason for this is that the child who conducts himself well, even though he be ignorant, is of benefit to others, while an ill-natured, ill-behaved child is corrupted and harmful to others, even though he be learned. If, however, the child be trained to be both learned and good, the result is light upon light. Abdul Baha.
Thank you so much to the Barhamis for the invitation to present this talk today, and thanks to all of you for choosing to listen. As was said, my name is Matt Giani. I'm a researcher and professor of education at the University of Texas at Austin. And before I dive into the substance of my talk, I thought I'd set the stage a bit with my research and kind of why I came into this topic in the first place. So my focus is basically answering this question in my own research, which is how do educational systems provide or prevent opportunities for social mobility? So the types of questions I often ask in my research are those such as how does socio-demographic background influence students' educational attainment? How does K-12 and higher education influence students' socioeconomic outcomes? And what kinds of policies, programs, and interventions can promote educational attainment, particularly for historically marginalized or underrepresented populations? And I probably don't need to make this case to many of you on the call today, but there's pretty stark inequalities in access to public education across the world today. Although significant progress has been made, as this map shows, this demonstrates the average years of schooling that have been attained by folks who are older than 25 across the world. And while countries such as the United States and Australia and Scandinavian countries and so forth have folks with about 14 years of education, so kind of high school plus 2 years of college on average, many other countries in the world have folks where only about 2 to 4 years of education is the norm. That's the total amount of public schooling that's available to folks. So of course, there's really significant inequalities across the world that we still need to address. But even in places like the United States, which today the majority of those who are young have an opportunity to enroll in public schooling, we see this is still a relatively recent phenomenon. Only about a century and a half ago, in the mid-1800s, roughly half of white students between the ages of 5 and 19 were enrolled in public school, and almost no students of other racial or ethnic backgrounds were enrolled in formal schooling. And over the century and a half that followed, we see a pretty dramatic transformation of the public education system. And this was caused by many things. Perhaps the most important would be compulsory schooling laws, where students were required to enroll in school, as well as the funding mechanisms that allowed public schooling to be a viable option, particularly for those who couldn't pay for private schooling. So today we see nearly all students who are in this age bracket between 5 and 19 in the US are indeed enrolled in public schools. And access to public education expanded so dramatically that eventually we saw the same trend occur in higher education. About a century ago, in roughly 1920, almost no students went to college. Only about 10% of all students between the years of 18 and 21 were enrolled in college. And in the preceding half century or so, once again, we see this really dramatic transformation. And this was a combination of the post-World War II period and the GI Bill, opening up higher education for returning veterans, the Civil Rights Act, expanding access to education, particularly for racial minorities, as well as other funding mechanisms that allowed folks to enroll in higher education when they weren't able to before. And of course, there's a wide body of research demonstrating the many benefits that are associated with increased educational attainment. This figure just shows one of those, which is that the more education one has, In general, the better one's socioeconomic outcomes, the more money you make, the less likely you are to be unemployed. And these are just a few of many pieces of information that demonstrate the benefits of increased educational attainment. But while education has expanded, particularly in more well-resourced countries, and we see many benefits associated with that expansion of public education, we also see some continued issues that really seem to plague the educational system. One of which is that we see pretty persistent disparities based on socioeconomic background for certain educational outcomes, one of which is college access. So although all economic groups have increased their college enrollment over time, these disparities between high-income families, middle-income families, and low-income families in the rates at which their children go on to higher education have persisted over the past 40 years or so. And if you look at the types of institutions that students enroll in, there's even greater socioeconomic stratification across those institutional types. And we see a similar pattern play out in terms of race ethnicity. Although all racial ethnic groups have increased their access to college and their likelihood of going to some type of post-secondary education after high school, we see the gaps in many respects have widened. And one kind of piece of data to support this is that of the increase in the numbers of students to go to college, those who maybe wouldn't have gone to college in the past but do go today, the majority of new white enrollments have gone to the most selective institutions in the country, while the majority of Hispanic and Black enrollments have gone to the less selective institutions, those such as regional kind of public universities, community colleges. So we see this growing stratification, this growing inequality in the types of colleges that students enroll in. And one product of this is that although we've expanded access to education, we actually see once again growing disparities in things like educational attainment. So this figure shows trends in the percentage of students who earn bachelor's degrees over time. And we actually see evidence that these gaps are getting wider. The top line is Asian American students, the orange one is white students, and you have Black and Hispanic students at the bottom. And those gaps are very large and in many instances continue to grow. So once again, we see expanded access to education, but still continued disparities in educational attainment. And we similarly see that we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of socioeconomic well-being and inequality and social mobility. This figure shows trends in income inequality between different income brackets. The top line comparing the income of those in the 90th percentile of the income distribution to those in the 10th percentile. And relative to the early 60s or the late 60s, income inequality has continued to increase. So much so that today, 1% of the world's population holds roughly 50% of the world's wealth. And to elaborate on that, the top two brackets here, the top one being those who have $1 million in wealth or more, 46% of the population, or excuse me, only 0.7% of the population falls into that bracket. Only 0.7% of the population holds $1 million of wealth or more, but collectively they hold 46% of the world's wealth. And if you combine those top two brackets, that's only about 8.5% of the global population, but they control over 80% of the world's wealth. On the other end of the spectrum, 70% of the global population controls only 2.7% of the world's wealth, a tiny fraction in relation to the fact that 7 out of every 10 people fall into that income bracket or that wealth bracket of having less than $10,000. And these inequalities also manifest themselves in educational attainment and educational achievement. This figure shows trends in inequality in educational achievement between different groups. And there's a lot going on in this figure, so let me just explain it a bit. You see that the dotted lines that are moving down are showing the trend in inequality between Black and white students, right? So white students had much higher test scores compared to Black students in the early 1940s, which, although is awful, is not a surprise given how much segregation and discrimination and systematic exclusion from public education was faced by Black Americans. But over time, that gap has actually declined quite a bit. In contrast, the solid line shows income inequality in educational achievement between high-income students and low-income students. And we see that that's actually increasing, right? So there's many reasons for this, but one of which is as wealth inequality is growing, wealthier families are investing more in the education of their children, and that's resulting in inequalities between high-income and low-income students actually growing rather than moving in the opposite direction. So when we put all of this together to try to get a picture of social mobility, we see that although the rhetoric of the United States is one of the land of opportunity where anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, where social mobility is open to all, particularly through education, the reality is not so rosy. This figure shows your average expected income in your mid-30s for students or children who were born into low-income households. And all of that red area are areas where the average income is essentially in poverty, between $20,000 and $30,000 of average income. And not just across the United States, but within specific metropolitan areas, we similarly see extreme inequalities in one's likelihood of social mobility and the likelihood that you're able to kind of lift yourself out of poverty, depending on your zip code and where you live. This is a figure of Austin, Texas, which is my hometown. And if you're familiar with Austin, you know that the line that's separating the dark red from the blue is Interstate 35, which has been a historical dividing line between communities of color and white communities largely. And that was caused by the systematic relocation of many Black and brown families east of I-35 into East Austin. And that inequality persists to this present day. I'm not as familiar with the geography of Washington, D.C., but I know many of you reside there as well. And we see a similar story here. I would bet that many of the areas that are red are those communities that have been under-resourced, marginalized, excluded from many facets of life, and their social mobility rates are much lower than in many wealthier parts of the Washington, D.C. metroplex. So let's just pause here and recap. First, we see that access to education has expanded globally, but substantial cross-country inequality remains. Educational attainment is strongly correlated with socioeconomic outcomes, so we see a lot of benefits of increased educational attainment. But even in those countries that have expanded access to education, such as the United States, we see extensive within-country inequalities in educational outcomes by factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, gender, the zip code you were born in, and so forth. So this expansion of access to education alone has not really disrupted the growing concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. While many benefits have come about from expanding access to education, we haven't seen necessarily a more just and equitable distribution of resources as a result. So before I go into the next part, which really dives into the concept of public education and what the Baha'i Faith says about it, let me just pause and ask, is this argument for the importance of education compelling? What language, perspectives, and conceptualizations am I using to frame education? What's the language that I'm using? How am I what assumptions am I making about the importance of education? To not discount anything that I've just covered, even the Baha'i Faith teaches that the future civilization envisaged by Baha'u'llah is a prosperous one, in which the vast resources of the world will be directed towards humanity's elevation and regeneration. And the second passage states, one of Baha'u'llah's teachings is the adjustment of means of livelihood in human society. So wealth and prosperity is good, inequality is bad, We need to do more to readjust these conditions of society, both educational and socioeconomic. However, I want to put forward a theory or an idea that perhaps the way that I've been talking about education is a bit limiting and is not necessarily aligned with the Baha'i conception. Although the reason I started with that framing is because it's so common in public education discourse. And I think it's something that we all need to be very cognizant of. There's a wonderful article by a historian and philosopher of education named David Lavery, who talks about the conflicting and evolving goals of public education. And in David Lavery's argument, there are these three goals that have really guided the evolution and reform and expansion of education over time, that he calls democratic equality, social efficiency, and social mobility. The first one, democratic equality, views schooling through the lens of a citizen. The domain of this framework is political. So the processes and the purposes of education are conceived in political terms. And from this lens, education is viewed as a public good. And the idea is that in order to have a well-functioning democracy, you need to have an informed citizenry where everyone has the capacity and desire and interest to participate in collective life, to vote in an informed way for candidates, to stay abreast of current issues and topics that are pressing in society. And to have that well-functioning democracy, everyone needs to have various knowledge and skills that allow them to participate, whether history or economics or politics or whatever disciplines might be most pressing, everyone needs to have some access to that level of education. So the ethic from this perspective is really around equal access and treatment for everyone. In contrast, the social efficiency goal views education from the perspective of the taxpayer. So as a taxpayer, what do I care about when I'm thinking about schooling? Well, I want a strong economy, right? That's the most important thing to me because that benefits everyone. That still is a public good framing of education because I'm thinking of the economy as a whole and the extent to which it benefits all. But really the question from this perspective is, how can we ensure that the educational system is aligned with the needs of the labor market, that there aren't labor shortages, that people have the knowledge and skills they need to work in different jobs, and we do that as efficiently as possible to slot students into their specific place in the economy to fulfill whatever economic needs exist. So the ethic here is really around vocationalism and differentiation, right? We need to differentiate students as efficiently as possible and prepare them for specific jobs that the economy needs. So from this perspective, it doesn't matter which student or which child ends up in which job, as long as the result is a well-functioning economy that's growing and benefits everyone. The third perspective views education also from an economic perspective, but from the perspective of the consumer of education, from the student, him or herself, or from the family that's making educational decisions about education. And from this perspective, education is viewed as a private good. The thought is, what can education do for me? How can it benefit me? How can it advance my career? How can I get into the most competitive college that I can? How can I make as much money as I can? How can I have the highest status position I can? So education is essentially a game where students compete over these goods, these private goods that are educational credentials that signify their skills and allow them to enter prestigious occupations and so forth. So the ethic here is really around stratification and individual status attainment. And just to say one other point, there's a wonderful article by a gentleman named Michael Carlberg, who's a member of the Baha'i Faith as well. And he talks about this idea of the culture of contest, which is really seeped into much of public life, where the ethic of contest is really deeply ingrained in so many institutions and facets of our life, whether that's the political system, the justice system, the kind of capitalist free market economy that's all about competition between companies and individuals. And I would argue that the same ethic, this culture of contest, is now the predominant logic of public education in service of this social mobility goal of how do we help students attain social mobility. And just as an example of that, this is one article I came across recently that says, you don't need a bachelor's degree to land a high-paying job. So this is a story from NPR, first of all. It's not in Forbes magazine or some other kind of heavily economic outlet. And yet we see this social mobility logic that's really speaking to the consumer of this article, right? First of all, it's saying you don't need a bachelor's degree. It's speaking to the consumer. It's not talking about the economy as a whole or the public goods of education. And secondly, the purpose of education is solely framed in terms of how much money you make, right? And the title is supported by this wonderful imagery of folks in all these kind of vocational occupations that are spewing money out of their fire hose, it appears, and coins are draining out of the pipe that this plumber appears to be working on. So if you just get the education you need to get a good job and make money, what joy, what happiness, what radiance will fill your life? This is the predominant logic that seems to have influenced public education over time. So we might ask ourselves the question of which framework is right of those three that I just presented. But I don't actually think that's the right question that we should ask. We might also ask which perspective comes closest to the Baha'i teachings. But many places in the Baha'i writings essentially state, don't judge the Baha'i teachings or the Baha'i writings about from the perspective of the ideologies or belief systems that are current amongst you, right? So don't try to interpret the Baha'i teachings through this lens. Instead, interpret society and other frameworks through the Baha'i teachings themselves. So instead, what I'm going to try to answer is, what does Baha'i public education look like? And we might then create a framework that stands in contrast to some of these other conceptualizations of public education. And using this framework might be able to have more informed conversations with our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors about the types of values that we bring to public education. So before I answer this question, I should say, I'm not really going to answer the question. And not for lack of trying, I'm going to do my best. But there's a few reasons that I'm not going to. The most obvious is, in many places in the writings, it states pretty emphatically, there is no Baha'i system of public education, right? There is as yet no such thing as a Baha'i curriculum. And this quote goes on, the task of formulating a system of education, which would be officially recognized by the cause and enforced as such throughout the Baha'i world, is one which the present-day generation of believers cannot obviously undertake, and which has to be gradually accomplished by Baha'i scholars and educationalists of the future. So we don't have a Baha'i public system of education. And in fact, even if we did, I should just state that I myself am not qualified to give the answer of what the Baha'i system of public education is. Because one of the core principles of the Baha'i Faith is the idea of the independent investigation of truth. Essentially, what that means is manifold, but one implication is we have no clergy in the Baha'i Faith. We have no authorized interpreters of the Baha'i teaching. So even though this is my field of public education, I am not at all qualified to serve as a representative or a mouthpiece of the Baha'i community to explain what the Baha'i teachings are. Nevertheless, what I'll do in the rest of the presentation is to highlight some passages and writings from the Baha'i Faith that inform our ideas about public education. And specifically, I'll draw on many of the writings from the central figures of the Baha'i Faith. The founder of the Baha'i Faith is named Baha'u'llah. His son is named Abdul Baha, and Baha'u'llah appointed Abdul Baha to be the head of the Baha'i Faith after Baha'u'llah's passing. Abdul Baha appointed Shoghi Effendi, who was his grandson, to serve as the head of the faith after that. And today, the Baha'i community is governed by the Universal House of Justice, which is a 9-member elected body of the Baha'i community. And you'll see from henceforth a number of passages from Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the Universal House of Justice, all of which Baha'is consider to be kind of authoritative figures in terms of the Baha'i teachings. So, before we just get into the writings themselves, let me first provide somewhat of a definition of public education so that we can then bring in the Baha'i teachings on public education itself. So what I would argue is that public education today is defined by 5 interrelated elements. The first is public access, or the idea that everyone should be able to go to school, no matter your race, religion, socio-economic background, and so forth. The second is public funding, which is essentially the mechanism to allow public access, that just because you can't pay for school doesn't mean you should be shut out from it. The third is that education should be a public good. The reason that societies invest in public education, rather than just having families pay for it themselves, is because of the collective goods that come out of public education. The fourth is public governance. So it's not just families or a private group of individuals that determine the content and curriculum and functioning of schools, but there's a whole system of governance, from local control with elected school boards to state legislatures and agencies influencing education, to federal governments and federal agencies and legislatures also influencing education as well. And finally, this idea of public accountability, which is really kind of recent day manifestation of how public schooling should be done, in which governments set certain kind of benchmarks or standards, and schools are expected to meet those standards. And if not, the schools are held accountable, and sometimes the students are held accountable also, such as by not being able to progress to the next grade unless they score a certain threshold on a standardized test score, for example. Schools can be shut down, or what's called reconstituted, if they don't meet these standards. So this idea of public accountability increasingly has been interconnected with all the other ideas of public schooling itself. So my argument there is that this is not an intrinsic aspect of public education necessarily, this public accountability, but it's pretty widespread in terms of the kind of current manifestation of public education. So what does the Baha'i Faith say about these different elements of public education? In terms of public access, the writings are very clear. All the children must be educated so that there will not remain one single individual without an education. A number of passages reinforce this point, that we believe in universal education, that everyone should have access to schooling during their childhood. And I would be remiss not to specifically mention the importance of the education of girls in this idea of public access in the Baha'i Faith. This is, once again, just one of many passages that underscore this point. And the interesting point here is that if one is in a situation where both their daughters and sons can't receive an education, preference should, if necessary, be given to the education of girls. And this, of course, is a complete 180 to how many countries and communities around the world have prioritized education, where the boys have been first in line to get access to schooling, while the girls have been shut out from schooling for much of human history. And the Baha'i Faith reverses that and places the emphasis on the education of girls. In terms of public funding, once again, there's a number of passages from the Baha'i Faith that drive home this point. If the parents are unable to educate their children, the body politic, the representative of the people, must provide the means for their education. And my personal interpretation is that the means two things. One is kind of the mechanism, like the schools or systems of education where students can learn, but also the financial means, right? If the parents are unable to educate their children, then the community needs to provide the financial means for that to become a reality as well. Similarly, once again, if the parents are able to provide the expenses of this education, it is well. Otherwise, the community must provide the means for the teaching of that child. And finally, this is kind of an extension of the previous point, but I find it to be really interesting. The previous passages seem to focus on if I can't pay for the education of my children, then the community should help to educate them. But in this passage, the interesting thing is that everyone, whether man or woman, should hand over to a trusted person a portion of what he or she earneth through trade, agriculture, or other occupation for the training and education of children. So this, in my interpretation, seems to be a justification for a system of taxation, where some of the funds that you earn from your livelihood are set aside specifically for the education of children. Now, this may be kind of second nature to us today, but many of these passages were revealed a century and a half ago, where this idea of public education and common schooling was very unusual and still a pretty revolutionary concept in many places. So the idea of public goods, as you might guess, a number of passages from the Baha'i Faith do emphasize the importance of the public goods aspects of education. This quote is very well known in the Baha'i Faith. Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Education can alone cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. That last passage, or that last line, is really the point I want to drive home, which is that the whole purpose of education is to enable mankind to benefit, right? It's not for my benefit. It's not for my social mobility. It's not for my status attainment or the type of job I get or how much money I'll make. But the purpose is to enable mankind to benefit from my education, right? So in no unclear terms, the Baha'i Faith very much supports the idea of the public goods mission of education. Similarly, when we think about societies as a whole, the Baha'i Faith states that it's inconceivable that any nation should achieve prosperity and success unless education is promoted. So once again, when we think about the kind of broader wealth and health of nations and societies, the Baha'i Faith believes that education is of paramount importance for that. Similarly, we believe in public goods, not just from an economic perspective, but really from a much broader perspective than that. And this passage emphasizes that through education, all mankind may become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. So here we view education from the terms of promoting unity of a society and collective well-being. So what about the idea of public governance, right? Who should govern education and what responsibilities should be held by different parties? Well, this passage, and specifically the underlined point, states that if necessary, education should even be made compulsory, right? So this seems to give support to the idea that some governance should be in place to essentially require students to receive their education. So if parents, for example, aren't able to provide their education, not only should access be given to children, kind of generally speaking, but it should actually be made compulsory to ensure that all students and all children receive an education. Specifically, there are passages that say, let the House of Justice take over the education of the children in the event that the parents fail in their duty to provide for their children's education. So once again, this is just an allusion to the idea that public governance for the promotion of education is supported in the Baha'i Faith. And finally, this passage isn't specific about education, but coming back to the idea of the kind of inequalities in society broadly and what we should do about that. This passage states that the remedy must be legislative readjustment of conditions, right? So I interpret this to say it's not just about just kind of general access, but we should use mechanisms of legislation to ensure equity, to ensure equality of opportunity for all students to receive their education. And finally, there's this idea of public accountability, but there aren't a lot of quotes from the Baha'i Faith that specifically reference this, but in a minute, I'll come back to this idea once we've gone through some other teachings and see if there's an alternative framework we could propose for this kind of current notion of public accountability. So all that's well and good. Sure, the Baha'i Faith seems to support public education, but wait, Matt, you might be saying to yourself, can public education really be Baha'i? This is actually a great question, and I would be surprised if no one asked it. And specifically in contexts like the United States and in many other countries, there is this idea of the Establishment Clause or the separation of church and state, which seems to say you can't have religious instruction in the context of public education. This is guidance from the US Department of Education that states teachers and other public school officials acting in their official capacities may not lead their classes in prayer, devotional readings from the Bible, or other religious activities, right? This is a pretty deeply held notion in terms of public schooling, that you can't have religious instruction because that's an instance of the government favoring one religion over the others. And that is not conducive to allowing individuals to freely choose what faith they would like to practice. Now, the Baha'i Faith does have passages about training the children in the principles of religion. So I think a surface reading might suggest, well, this idea of public education in the Baha'i Faith is really incompatible with the notion of public education in countries like the United States. How can you have public education that's Baha'i inspired, that's devoid of religious instruction? But in fact, I think, once again, this is kind of a false dichotomy, right? And I hope that the passages we cover in a moment help us think more broadly about what Baha'i, quote unquote, public education might mean, and how we can inform public education through the Baha'i teachings. So I'm just going to go through a few subjects here. It's impossible to cover the full gamut of topics that might pertain to this, but I'm specifically going to talk about three elements of public schooling, which are curriculum, pedagogy, and teachers and teaching. In other words, what should be taught, how should it be taught, and who should teach it? What do the writings say about these three topics? So let's start with curriculum. One thing that's really critically important is that training in morals and good conduct is far more important than book learning, right? So you might have this idea, which is more important, kind of character instruction or academic content? And the Baha'i Faith places the emphasis on character first and foremost. But of course, as the end of this passage states, if, however, the child be trained to be both learned and good, the result is light upon light. So of course, we're not discounting the importance of the knowledge and skills students acquire as a result of their education, but the primacy is really on character in the Baha'i Faith. Another question might be about standardization versus differentiation, right? So how standardized should the education system be, and should public education be, versus how differentiated it might be? If you're unfamiliar with this idea of standardization, it's a really integral part of public education in the United States. And as this quote, which is not from the Baha'i Faith, but from some scholars of education, states, that America's national education strategy is called standards-based reform. So the idea that there should be standards that clearly define what all students should know and do at the end of their public schooling, and all students should be held to that same standard, right? And in fact, the public accountability system is a way to ensure that that's taking place. So what does the Baha'i Faith say about this idea of standardization versus differentiation? Well, interestingly, there are quotes supporting this idea of standardization. So as Abdu'l-Baha states, education is essential and all standards of training and teaching throughout the world of mankind should be brought into conformity and agreement. A universal curriculum should be established and the basis of ethics be the same. The next passage also states that children from their earliest years should master every kind of learning and make them eager to become skilled in every art. So these passages seem to suggest that education should be standardized and all students should be held to the same standard. But I think this must also be balanced with this idea that each of us has different capacities, and the Baha'i Faith is really clear about that. As this quote states, the portion of some might lie in the palm of a man's hand, the portion of others might fill a cup, and of others even a gallon measure. In other words, we don't all have the same capacity. So while we might have a kind of universal curriculum and common expectations, really the idea should be, what are the latent strengths and capacities and talents of each individual child, and how do we nurture those? Rather than having students compete against each other to attain the exact same standard, how do we ensure that children are fulfilling their own potential, even though their potential may differ? One kind of elaboration of this idea is the potential tension between academic versus more technical or vocational education. So the standardization idea might suggest, oh, all students should learn the exact same thing, so it should be a kind of broad academic curriculum that all students pursue. And while the quote on the left does suggest that the arts and sciences and traditional academic disciplines are very important, the second quote, I think, is quite important in the current context of public education, which is that crafts and trades and other vocations have been exalted to the rank of worship by Baha'u'llah. And this is from the Kitab-i Aqdas, which is Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws. So in our current public education culture, these vocational pathways or technical pathways or crafts or what have you don't have the same prestige or the same value as the more traditional academic disciplines. But in fact, these types of professions are critically important and are exalted to the rank of worship in the Baha'i Faith. So once again, I think the idea is to provide students with opportunities to develop their own skills and talents, not just have one set of standards that we hold all students to no matter what. And finally, what about the idea of success versus service? This gets to the kind of social mobility ethic that underlies much of education. In contrast, the Baha'i Faith states clearly, service to the world of humanity should be obligatory. Every student should know with perfect certainty that he is the brother of the people of all religions and nations, and that he should be without religious, racial, national, patriotic, or political bias. So once again, our current ethic is about success as defined by the individual student. And really in the Baha'i Faith, it's quite clear that the ethic is about service to the world of humanity, and that should be our primary motivation. Now, what about pedagogy? What might the Baha'i Faith say about pedagogy? Once again, I should state that there is no such thing as Baha'i pedagogy, and matters of pedagogy can be best discovered through systematic educational experience. It depends on what's being taught and to which students and in which contexts and cultures. But there are at least a few ideas that we can draw from the Baha'i Faith. One of which is this idea about elementary education, which is that students cannot be taught through books. Many elementary sciences must be made clear to the children in the nursery. They must learn them in play, in amusement. Most ideas must be taught them through speech, not by book learning. So we see, even when children are very young, we have this ethic of the students working together, of playing with each other, of socializing, and asking each other questions back and forth on a kind of equal playing field, rather than this rote memorization and book learning to see which students kind of excel above the others. But although this kind of naturalistic pedagogy might be promoted in the Baha'i Faith, that doesn't mean that the school should be a place of disorder where students can do whatever they want. In fact, the Baha'i Faith states that the children's school must be a place of utmost discipline and order. And importantly, this matter of instruction, of character rectification and refinement, of heartening and encouraging the child is of the utmost importance. So the interesting thing here is that the instruction is not just about math and science and social studies and English language arts, but it's about the refinement of character. And the school has to be a place of order and discipline so that children are able to develop those virtues and they're able to work together in a spirit of unity. So finally, what about teaching? as the faith states, the education and training of children is among the most meritorious acts of humankind. And I love this quote because unfortunately, it stands in contrast to what I see as the most common view of teachers, which is not one of respect, which is the idea that those who can't do teach, that colleges of education are some of the least selective in the country, that if you want to get a real job, you should study medicine or engineering or law. Among the most meritorious acts of humankind is the view of teaching in the Baha'i faith. And in fact, teachers are doctors of character. Let the teacher be a doctor to the character of the child. Thus will he heal the spiritual ailments of the children of men. Another metaphor is that the teacher is like the spiritual father, right? Nurturing the soul and the spirit of the child. And I think all these quotes are so important because right now in public discourse, the primacy placed on teachers is about their knowledge and skills, which are important, of course, but the idea is that they need to be able to impart those academic knowledge and skills to students so that students can gain those academic knowledge and skills so they can graduate and get great test scores and earn good grades and get into the best colleges, right? So even teachers are viewed through this social mobility lens. And the emphasis on the character of teachers is really quite minimized, in my view, in public discourse. So if we put all of these ideas from the Baha'i faith together, what kind of ethic, what kind of framework might we be able to draw from the Baha'i faith to view public education? Well, there's a lot more to elaborate on here, but just a few ideas that I'd share is that the Baha'i faith really views public education from the perspective of the community, and the framework might be called one of community building. So education is viewed in both social and spiritual terms first and foremost, right? That education is about this twofold moral purpose of developing one's talents and skills so they can serve humanity, and by serving humanity, developing one's talent and skills, right? So of course, education is viewed from a public good perspective, from the Baha'i faith as well. But in contrast to this idea of public accountability that I alluded to previously, I'd argue that the Baha'i faith really promotes an ethic of community accountability, that it's about all of our responsibility to develop our own skills to help each other advance, to help our neighborhoods advance, our communities advance, and our societies advance, and that we all have the moral responsibility to do that, right? Our goal is not to advance our own careers, it's to provide benefit to our communities, our neighbors, and our society. So just to conclude, I personally study public education. So of course, this is aligned with my career, but you might be asking, well, so what? What do these teachings have anything to do with me, or how I might interact with the public education system? I would just end with a few kind of questions for discussion, which are, what are the values we bring to bear on evaluating and choosing schools, right? How important are test scores and school ratings and the percentage of kids who got into the most selective colleges, and all of these aspects of social mobility, right? Of helping my kid get into the best school or the best college that they can, right? How are our values being influenced by this kind of social mobility framework that's so influential in public education? In contrast, how can we shape the values that inform schooling through our discourse, educational decisions, and advocacy, right? How can we promote an ethic of community building, of character refinement, of having students develop their skills, not to get good grades and test scores and get into the best college, but to better serve their communities? And finally, I think this is something that I struggle with, and maybe many of you do as well, but I think it's important for all of us to ask the question of how much time do we spend focused on our children's education compared to the education of other children in our neighborhood, community, country, or world. One of the big paradoxes of the past century and a half is educational opportunity has expanded and inequality has grown. we have not made the world more equal. And until particularly those of us with more privilege and more resources make a really concerted effort to redistribute our privilege and resources and access to education for those who have less access than we do, the world is not going to become more just. And I think it's up to us to really work for equity and justice in order to develop public schooling that helps achieve a just and equitable and prosperous future society. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stay on for a bit and answer them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I found that very interesting. Thank you so much for giving us the time. Maybe if you want to stop sharing now, we can get to some Q&A. So the first question is, could you go back to the graphs and explain in a little more detail?
I might want some clarity on which graph, but I will go back as quickly as possible to many of the graphs that were presented early on. Would anyone like to share which specific graph they were asking about?
Yeah, Sandra, if you could.
This one?
Verify. Maybe we'll go to the next question until she lets us know which graph. The next question is, what does the term domain mean?
I saw that question, and I think it was referring to this table where it talks about the domain. So what I think David Labrie would argue is that what's the kind of aspect of life or of society that's being considered when public schools or public education is being viewed from this perspective? So from the democratic equality perspective, you're viewing education in terms of its political dimension, in terms of its relationship with the political system, which in the United States and many other places is a democratic system. So the question is, how is public education fulfilling political goals, which is to have a well-informed citizenry that can vote on issues and elect members of Congress and representatives in an informed way, in contrast to the social efficiency and social mobility perspectives, which really view education in economic terms. It's less about the kind of functioning of our citizenry and of our democracy, and it's really about how important is education for the economy, right? So things like, is education helping to grow GDP? Is it reducing unemployment? Is it increasing earnings? Those are the types of questions that would be asked from that perspective because the domain is economic. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
The next question, have you looked into ANISA or Sunwalk, which are two proposed models of Baha'i-inspired education? I would love to get your expert opinion on either one or both, if so.
Yes, a bit, although I don't know if I would be qualified to provide much additional context or kind of perspective on those views. And one thing that I actually didn't mention much in the talk is that obviously the Baha'i community globally has lots of experience in various forms of education, from children's classes that happen in neighborhoods with small groups of children and families, to more formal kind of systematic schools or educational enterprises, which number in the hundreds across the Baha'i community and around the world at the moment. So I thought about talking about some examples of specific Baha'i endeavors, but I didn't necessarily want to do a compare and contrast of this method or the other, because I think the principle that I would suggest is that, you know, these are all kind of individual educational efforts at the moment,
and still that there wouldn't necessarily be like a single Baha'i curriculum, Baha'i pedagogy. So I didn't want to place undue emphasis on one specific endeavor or project, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
And regarding the graph, it was the first few slides in the introduction.
All right, let me see if I can go there. So, a couple different graphs. Let's see, a few of these. This one? This one's one of my favorites. I love when there's color-coded maps. But I'm not 100% sure which. So perhaps if it's the first few slides in the introduction, perhaps
it's the graph.
I can just, okay, I'll go through these just a bit more. So this is a figure just showing trends in the percentage of students who are enrolled in school. Specifically, this is about 5 to 19-year-olds, so basically young children, and what percentage of them are enrolled in some school, specifically in the United States. So as you can see, in 1850, when the timeline begins, almost no students who are not white were enrolled in public schools at the time, and only about 50% of white students were enrolled in public schools. And those rates have dramatically increased to the point where more than 90% of children in the United States are now enrolled in school. And the next one just shows for higher education. So the previous figure was just about public schooling and for 5 to 19-year-olds. This is a figure showing college enrollment for 18 to 21-year-olds, and basically just making the point that access to higher education has also expanded greatly in places like the United States and many other countries. And researchers would describe this as like the massification of higher education, where now the masses, all of us are able to access higher education, at least in principle.
Great, thanks. So then the follow-up question is, how is it that we still have such discrepancies?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a framework or a way to think about this that doesn't come from the Baha'i Faith, but I personally find it quite persuasive. If you search in the literature, there's two related ideas called maximally maintained inequality or effectively maintained inequality. There's some slight differences between them, but the thrust is this. When access to education expands in some level, the bar basically moves. And those who have the resources where they're able to invest in their children's education and able to grow their access even more, increase their educational attainment even faster than folks who are historically excluded from education. So concretely, what does that mean? Well, first, public schooling was not very common. Most people didn't have access to public schools. Only the wealthy were really able to enroll in public schools. Eventually, primary education became nearly universal, but then the more wealthy families were able to send their students to high school, right, to secondary education. Well, then access to secondary education expanded, where now nearly 90% of all students graduate from high school. But then college enrollment became the kind of privilege of the elite. Now that college enrollment has expanded, we see stratification in the types of institutions folks attend. So access to the more elite and selective institutions continues to be dominated by those who have the means and the resources to gain access to them, while others who are less privileged don't have the same resources. So in other words, there's various kind of social processes that explain why access to education can expand, but inequality can remain or even grow. And really, you know, the Baha'i Faith talks so much about spiritual solutions to economic problems. I don't think these issues are frequently viewed in spiritual terms from a kind of dominant policy discourse perspective. But I think part of the challenge is that there is so much competition, and the perspective is that education is so valuable for my child that I will do anything in my power to get my kid the best tutor, the best academic resources, the private college admissions counselor, whatever resources I have at my disposal to maximize my child's social mobility. I'm willing to invest in those things because of the importance of educational attainment. So of course, as wealth inequality has grown, the amount of investment in education, particularly for the wealthy, has grown much faster than, of course, those who don't have access to the same resources. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's one explanation for why ostensibly access to education has grown, and yet inequality has either remained the same or actually gotten worse in many places.
Got it. Thank you. Are all elements of Baha'i education currently found in the various educational systems, public or private? Do you see education moving towards the Baha'i model in an evolutionary manner, or will it require a complete new system that must be adopted?
Ooh, that's a great question. I have no idea. I would love everyone's thoughts on that. And I think like any, or at least many kind of social phenomenon, I would argue that we see the processes of disintegration and integration occurring simultaneously in the context of education. I think we see some evidences that these previous notions that guided education in the past are causing more harm than good, and folks are seeking for new ways of thinking. So for example, I briefly alluded to this idea of accountability being a kind of growing movement in education over the past couple of decades, and that's really kind of government accountability from the federal and state government in particular. But now you have this movement which is about community accountability, right? Which is about communities should have autonomy in kind of setting the goals of their schools, of their education. They should have more choice in terms of like what comprises education for them. So that's one example of kind of reactionary perspective to the dominant discourse in education that I think would be more aligned with the Baha'i teachings. I think also you see a lot of really interesting research that is now still viewing education from a public goods perspective, but not in purely economic terms, right? So how does education promote unity and promote well-being? And how can we help people eliminate prejudice, right? What does anti-bias training look like for teachers to eliminate prejudice in their hearts so they don't reflect that prejudice when they're teaching children? I think many of those things would be very aligned with the Baha'i perspectives. So I think like many things, we see some indications that public education is moving in the direction of what could be considered the Baha'i vision. But in other instances, it's arguably going the wrong direction, such as increased competition over scarce educational goods, viewing education in largely economic terms. I still think those are kind of the dominant discourses in education, which aren't as aligned with the Baha'i perspective.
Thank you. Have you also looked at higher education of women compared to men?
I have, a little bit. I'm not an expert in that field necessarily, but it's a really beautiful story, I think, because we all know that women were systematically excluded from all facets of society for a very long time. And even in what we might think is a more progressive, forward-thinking nation like the United States, I mean, women didn't have the right to vote until the early 20th century, if my history recalls. And women were also excluded from higher education in particular. There were a few schools specifically for women and a few colleges that accepted women, but by and large, up through the kind of mid-20th century, women were vastly underrepresented in terms of higher education enrollment. And within the span of maybe half a century, really since like the mid-1950s through the present, women have exceeded men in many domains in K-12 education and in higher education, so much so that now there is concern about boys and men and how they're doing in higher education, that they're dropping out at rates much higher than women. Female educational attainment is increasing at a much faster rate and has surpassed men. Now, there's still really important disparities, particularly in particular fields, such as the STEM disciplines, in the sciences, math, engineering, computer science. Many of those fields continue to demonstrate underrepresentation of women, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be. The climate for women is often very hostile in some of those disciplines. But by and large, I think the story of female advancement in education and the fact that women have really surpassed men in terms of educational attainment, I think bodes extremely well for that glass ceiling continuing to be shattered and women, surpassing men in many other kind of social and economic fields as well.
Thank you. Would you describe the current education practice as including women or different colors based purely on economic need?
Could you say the question one more time, just to make sure I understood?
Would you describe current education practice as including women or different colors based purely on economic need?
Women. Is it possible to rephrase?
I'm
reading the question in the chat as well. I don't know if this is exactly the intention of the question. I do think there is, even in instances which public discourse seems to promote equity, we need more women in this field, we need more people of color to enter this field or to enter higher education. I do think it's often framed in the wrong terms. So for example, sometimes you see language about the country is diversifying at a fast rate. So it's an economic imperative to provide access to education to people of color, because otherwise it's going to be really damaging for our economy, because there's not going to be enough workers in all sorts of places. So I don't know if that's necessarily the intention of the question, but I would fully agree that in many places, even when it seems like there are arguments in favor of expanding access to education, it's not really about seeking justice. It's not about allowing everyone to develop their unique capacities and talents so they can contribute to the advancement of civilization. It's not viewing humanity from a perspective of oneness and ensuring that everyone has equal access to opportunity. It's really about, oh no, if we don't provide education to this group or this group, it will be bad for all of us, right? It will be bad for the economy. It will be bad for society. So I do think we should all be wary of that discourse that really frames diversity as a negative. Fundamentally, it views diversity oftentimes as a threat, and it's by necessity we have to expand access to education. So yeah, I would fully agree that even though there are some arguments to expand education, it's not always for the right motives or the right purpose.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to stop sharing until anyone has any other questions about the slide.
Do we have any other questions? I'll pause for a minute. Okay, it looks we have one more question. Please explain the graph where the trends crossed.
I will try to do that. Let me go back to sharing my screen. This is a particularly complicated graph, and I know I went through it very quickly, so I'm not surprised. There is some clarification needed. So let me just elaborate on this a little bit. There are two main lines here, technically three, but there's one line that's going up. So basically each one of these dots is a different survey or data collection that has occurred, and they happen at different times, but generally federal agencies will do a longitudinal survey of a group of students. They'll follow them over time, and then researchers will look at that data to calculate things like inequality in test score performance or educational outcomes or so forth. So we have the line going up, right? So basically this is an estimate of the trend in inequality in test score performance between high-income kids and low-income kids. So the kind of y-axis here is what is the gap in test score performance between these two groups. So how you interpret the line going up is that inequality is getting worse. We're actually seeing growing inequality based on income. The other lines, the dotted lines, are estimating the trend in the black-white test score gap. So this is the difference in academic performance between white students and black students. And we see that is going down. Now, there is still work to do. There is still much inequity in the educational system that needs to be addressed. But we see that inequality based on race has been reduced as a result of things like the civil rights movement, Brown v. Board of Education, expanded funding for communities of color and schools which serve large populations of students of color. And yet, despite that progress in closing racial inequalities, we're actually seeing increases in socioeconomic inequalities, that wealth seems to matter even more for children's educational achievement than it did in the past. And that's a really troubling sign that we hope to reverse.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so it looks like that's the last question. So thank you again so much. I think we all learned a lot from that. And if you are not already on our mailing list, we'll have this video on our YouTube channel. We'll send it out. I put the link to our contact form in the chat so you can sign up for our mailing list. And next week, our speaker will be Ms. Talisa Hayes, and she'll actually be kind of continuing this theme, talking about early Baha'i childhood education. So again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time. So please invite all your friends and family. And we're going to end today with another song. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Saturday.